Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com here in San Diego, California. So for all things Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. So if you followed the prior videos, I've disassembled the motor obviously. I've put bearings in a brand new set of cases. Pretty similar steps if you have the original engine cases. These are the Malossi cases, so there's some differences and I'll talk about them as I go through it. Well, this is gonna be the fun video, and it goes pretty quick. When you're all organized, there's not that many parts inside of one of these P200 or a PX125, or pretty much any of the vintage Vespa motors. Pretty simple motors, but there's definitely some tricks to successfully assembling them. So I'm gonna go ahead and stuff the gears, the kickstart setup, the clutch, the crankshaft, put the cylinder on there, and close up these cases today. And the next video, I'll get the motor into the frame, and then so on, we'll get it running, and then I have some extra special videos coming after the motor's all installed and ready to go. So that bearing is still in good shape. Just to show you how this all works, there's my needle bearings, the circlip, and a new locking tab right there. So there's your bearing and everything. It's all cleaned out. This bearing is still in really good shape. They usually last quite a long time. Nice and quiet. There's not any wobble in it. And it's good to put a little bit of oil, have a little oiler with some Motul trans oil or non-detergent 30 weight oil is fine. One thing I'm not doing is rebuilding this cush drive. You can look at my prior video on rebuilding the P125 engine. I think we covered overhauling the cush gear. It was several years ago. It's still a valid video. I'm gonna drop that in there. I'm gonna find a socket that fits on the outside, tap that all the way in. So I got 1/8" socket. I think you probably do the same thing with a 28mm socket, 27mm socket. And I'm trying to do this in front of the camera, so it's a little harder than it should be. So find your circlip, find the sharp edge, that's the edge that's gonna face out. And if this is warped or anything, I would just replace it. It's in there nice and tight, so we're all good. And at this point, just give it a little tap. So the shaft is floating around in there. So you got the shaft in here, and we're gonna go ahead in your empty cases. Then kind of jog that in to the engine there. And this shaft kind of turns, that's fine. You can see it misses everything. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this around. I'm gonna try to do this so everybody can see what I'm doing. It's partly installed. I have most of this bearing surface exposed. The next step is we're gonna grease this up and reinstall those 21 loose needle bearings. So I have them all ready to go. As you see, I have the table with paper on it. So you could either use assembly lube or just Maxima waterproof grease will work. Just something to hold the bearings in place, as sometimes it could be a little tricky. Just kind of do a little light coat. You don't want to get too crazy. You put too much grease in the motor, it can affect the operation of the clutch. So just go ahead and set the needle bearings in there. Sometimes you got to go kind of crooked and then straighten them out. Sometimes you got to pull the shaft out just a little bit more. Just start setting them in there. And it's a little hard with gloves on. I tend to like to do this without gloves. And usually I'll be sitting in front of it, not behind it. And if they're just kind of on the fritz of wanting to fall out, a little extra grease on the top side will help too. So here we got the last two to install. And it's pretty normal that you have a gap. You almost can get 22 in there, but I think that's, the tolerances will be a little too tight with 22 needles in there. So with 21, we're all set, and kind of just smear a little bit more to make sure that they all stay in place. And I gave up with the gloves. At this point, you just want to carefully give it a couple little taps, make sure none of the needles slide out, because sometimes they'll want to slide out. Makes a little tap, and that's where it's all the way seated. We probably do need to do some alignment on the where the slot is. We're going to go ahead and flip the motor around. And we have this tab washer. It's got the little tang on there. You're going to need to rotate the shaft around, and sometimes I just use a needle nose carefully on the threads and just kind of rotate it around. The slot should be right there. I don't know if the camera's going to get that, but kind of just work the tab washer right on there. I'm not even looking what I'm trying to do, and it's pretty close right there. And the next step is you have this special hardened washer right here that the bolt goes up against. There's a little bit thicker side. Kind of keys up with the case right there. And then we'll start threading the nut. So sometimes you got to give it a couple taps to get the tab washer to seat. Bend the tangs out, especially on these Malossi cases, a little thicker there. Take a large needle nose pliers. Go ahead and tap that in. Or it's possible also use a punch to do that as well. Like you could just get in there and this all works perfect. It's all tight. Next, we're gonna move on to the lay shaft. All right, so 2 videos ago, I talked about setting up this shim here and making sure that the gears are all in good condition. We've already verified that. There's only one thing that we haven't done. We haven't put a brand new Italian shifting cross in there. So we also have the original Piaggio ones, but these Italian ones are pretty decent quality. So we're gonna go ahead and take the circlip back off on the gear stack here. We know the shim's set up right. So when you disassemble the gears, just be cautious of the order that you take them off. So usually I just like stacking them. So with the gears removed from the lay shaft, take a 19mm socket. Don't want to hit the end of that you hear the change in note when that bottomed out? That's right where you want it. The way you could get the shifting cross off is you could put a combination wrench into the slot right there. And you got to remember this is reverse thread, so it's like I'm tightening. There we go. And oftentimes, if it's the original shifting cross, they swage the end of the threads, so they're quite difficult. But this one has Loctite on it. And that's the best practice. If you're replacing the shifting cross, just put Loctite on the threads. We'll do that when we put the new one in. And you can see there's a shim washer right here. Looks like it's going to stay in place. The way you get the shifting cross out on these older gearboxes is you just shift it, flip it around, on the round side. So you see a square set of parts of the shifting cross and the round set. So we have the selector shaft. There's a special washer. It's got a little bevel on it. The bevel goes towards the inside. And I went ahead and cleaned up the threads on a wire wheel just to make sure they're in good shape. Before you even install the cross, you want to make sure it threads on. This is reverse thread. Here in my workshop, I do have a tap and die for this style, but it's not something that most people are going to have. But make sure it threads on, most of the way. Just kind of check it out. If it doesn't, you may want to go in there with a little file and clean up the threads. So we know it's good. I'm going to leave that washer in place. So again, there's the round parts of the shifting cross. If you're rebuilding the later gearboxes, they're going to have a completely different shifting cross, and there's a hole that you line it up with. But you just go ahead and slot it in there and turn it around, and it's the flat and that's facing out. Let's go ahead and put a dot of blue Loctite on the threads. You'll find this pretty much anywhere. And while you're holding the shifting cross, go ahead and get it started. It's very easy to cross thread that. That's why I checked, make sure it was threading in, no issues. So it's got a couple turns on it. Take my 13mm combination wrench and start tightening this up. And I'm going it's a reverse thread, so we're right at the bottom here. Don't want to get too crazy on it. It took a lot of effort to break it free, but go ahead and tighten that. Make sure it slides in and out, so we're good there. All right, so we'll go ahead and drop the gears in place. Just put a little bit of oil on all these metal surfaces right here. Doesn't need much. We'll go ahead and drop the gears. So that's the back side of the gear that goes towards the wheel. Drop it in there, you engage it with the Christmas tree, as I like to call it. Do the same. This is second gear, you can see a larger gap kind of facing out. And then first gear's got a very large gap for where neutral is. And we already know that the shim is all set up. Let's drop that in place. Find the sharp edge of your circlip. And make sure it's all the way around in the gap, so we're all set right there. So we're gonna go ahead and install the crank, and this whole tool setup is Tool Crank on the Scooter West web store. It's a very useful tool. As you saw, I put the flywheel side bearing on with it. You're going to need to find the correct adapter that threads onto the clutch side and thread that in. It's a 17 to tighten it up. And then you want to set up the tube. So you got this larger side ready to go. And I'm going to put some type of grease on your seal right there. Just like that, all the way around. And I checked out to make sure there's no pitting. I know this crank is true. Everything's under 1/1000th on all the clearances. A lot of times I like to put a little bit of oil into that big end bearing, kind of work it in there. Make sure that feels really good. I think this crank's in pretty nice shape. This motor was nice and quiet. We're just rebuilding it because it had a pretty egregious oil leak. So I have the rotary valve surface kind of facing up, and the rod, you kind of got to support it. Go ahead and put that in place. We're going to take the tool from the backside. I'm going to thread the tool onto the end of the crankshaft here. Typically, I like to thread them all the way on so you don't have any likelihood of damaging the threads. I'm gonna have one set up on the tube. There's a set of flats machined onto the tube there. And it's pretty critical to keep this rod in place. So at this point, we're just gonna tighten the nut. And it is possible to do this with the parts of the clutch and the clutch nut, but it's probably not the safest idea. So right when it bottoms out, that's right where you want it. And we'll spin it around. It spins all freely, so we're all set up there. And at this point, we'll go ahead and remove the tool. So pretty much you got the crankshaft, the intermediate shaft, and the lay shaft in here, and that's pretty much all you have set up inside in the engine. Now we're gonna work on the Kickstarter. So I got an original Piaggio gasket set. I find they're pretty decent quality. We're not gonna use the case half gasket. Part number is 154546PA. There's other options of gasket kits that we have, less expensive ones. But the Piaggio one's not all that expensive, and they come with treated, decent quality gaskets. So normally with a stock engine case, you'd use the case gasket. This Malossi set, we're gonna actually essentially glue the cases together. So you wanna separate out the O-rings. There's this one O-ring that's just on its own. It's kind of smaller than these large set of 3 O-rings right here. And in here, you're gonna make sure you put the O-ring in there. And I already did that because I think the Malossi case may have came with the O-ring. So essentially you grease it, you push it right into that groove right there. We're gonna replace both of the Kickstart stops. There's one for each of the stops, both the end and the start of the travel of the Kickstarter. Sometimes these are pretty difficult to get in, I find. And if that's the case, I'll just trim them. Just trim a little bit off the edge, makes them go in there a little easier. You would put oil on them, because they ultimately are just bathed in the oil. Anyways, the other thing is these cases are a little harder to put them in, I think. All right, so you get it started by hand, and you can use a flat blade screwdriver to kind of push it all the way home. I find it's a little more stubborn than the stock cases on this, but going in there. And pretty much do the same steps. Another thing I like to do is sometimes if the rubber kind of goes past the gasket surface, you could carve that off too if you like. Probably best to use like a nice sharp razor blade. All right, so now that we got the 2 rubber stops in, a little bit of grease on your Kickstart. Make sure the Kickstart shaft isn't bent, or if it was difficult to remove, it'd be a good idea just to replace this. The splines can get damaged, they can get bent. And just carefully slide that into place and make sure it turns nice. And the spring, it's just the way I like to do the spring. It just puts some muscle into it. So you got that little peg that's gonna go into the case. So in the past, I've been able to just grip it and drop it right on there. But you could use like an adjustable plier carefully and just pre-wind the spring. And right when it's about to line it with the peg, just drop it right in there. Give it a couple little taps, and there you go. It's been seated and it's been sent home. Keep in mind the bearings are all in there, so that's pretty important. And at this point, I usually like to have the Kickstarter on or installed. Kind of adds as a nice grab handle. So be careful not to push it too far, because you'll push the Kickstart right back out. Put the bolt right in place. Flatten a split washer. 13mm combination wrench. Sometimes a 14. And you can see the kickstart mechanism in here. So while we have the grease out, take a little dab of grease and put it in this slot right here. Both sides, you could put a little bit of grease on each side right here. I'm going to take your kickstart spring. This one's still pretty nice and straight. Give it a little stretch sometimes. And kind of the area that's open, you just use the grease, and the grease kind of just holds it in place. So the kickstart gear, oftentimes you just want to replace this. This one looks to be in really nice shape. All the little paws are pretty sharp looking. And I always like to test fit them. You want to make sure they have some wobble to it. Sometimes the different brands, the clearances aren't quite good, and this is bad news when they want to lock up. So just a small amount of grease on this metal-to-metal surface here. And on that, so go ahead and set that up just like such. We're going to go ahead and flip the case up. Just like that. And I tend not to use an engine stand. A lot of people do like to use engine stands like this. I find that they're in the way and not really needed for these simple engines. All right, regardless if you're using brand new Malossi cases or the original cases, you want to clean the gasket mating surfaces. Usually you like to use something like brake cleaner on a nice clean disposable rag here. Just go all the way around. Kind of just wipe all the gasket surfaces so they're oil free. Because even if you had the cases clean, just the act of touching it, puts oil back on all these parts here. Your kickstart gear stays in place. That's all pretty clean. So if we were dealing with a stock engine case, you would have all the studs in here. This case actually uses bolts to hold it together. They normally use 7mm studs, but on a stock engine case, you drop a gasket. This is a nice treated gasket. Just to show you, the Malossi engine cases are patterned after the stock, so you can see the original engine would have a dowel right here. The Malossi cases use much larger dowels, and there's also an extra bolt that clamps the case down that's not found on the stock engine cases. So I like to put a little bit of grease on this little ramp surface right here because the seal is going to want to ride up that edge. A little bit of grease on this, and you can do a little grease on this here as well. Make sure you don't get too much on the taper. We'll go ahead and wipe that off. On the other side case, you want to make sure these needle bearings have some initial oil on them. Wipe it all around. And since we're not using a gasket, you want to use a fuel and oil resistant gasket maker. Typically, one of the best products you buy is something like this Permatex Moto Seal. You could buy a Honda Bond. Loctite makes a similar product. I think the Malossi book has a recommendation. This is very standard. You find it on two-stroke dirt bike engines and a lot of other motorcycle engines. So this is pretty standard that you pretty much glue together cases. Many of the gearboxes on the modern Vespas use this kind of stuff, and we'll just put a little bit on there. The nice thing is it's not like silicone sealant, so whatever residue it leaves behind isn't really going to hurt anything. There's no oil pumps or anything on these engines. So, And another thing you could do is you can have a little popsicle stick to kind of even out the gasket material. So I'll probably get one out just so I could spread it around. Kind of want to just get it evenly everywhere. All right, so it kind of levels out is what I find. And we'll tack up a little bit, and that's okay. Typically you do want this to tack up just a little bit, and we'll do the other side engine case half as well. Try not to get into the threads because it does affect the installation of the studs or the bolts, and same with the dowels. You don't want it to hang up the dowels. And you can see there's areas I haven't been able to get it applied to, so I'll apply it to the stick, and I'm not going to hurt the connecting rod a little bit there. Just don't need much of it. These cases are so finely machined that if you put excess amounts, it just kind of goos out, so it's not. A piece of the towel there, get that out of there. A lot of times you can get some excess just by scraping with the popsicle stick off other areas. Just kind of look over the whole case, make sure it's all covering all the metal areas. You want it to seal up nice. And we'll do the easy side here. So probably do it even lighter on this side. Pretty much the same kind of setup, just smear it around. And if those are those rubber stops for your Kickstart are protruding a little bit, it's not going to hurt anything. They're going to compress when we bolt the cases together. So and you can watch my prior video on the P125 if you do want to see how it's done with a stock engine that just uses a gasket. Much simpler. Obviously there's a little bit more, one more step, but in many ways it's a much more robust setup. This has much less leakage and issues. You don't have a gasket that that will fail. This stuff usually might need a little bit more there, but I got excess right here, so I think we got a nice even coat here. So like I said, it's not going to be the end of the world if it tacks up a little. So go ahead and have all our Malossi hardware while that's tacking up a little bit. So you got the two dowels, that's pretty important. So go ahead and set those in place. One goes right there. We have another one that goes back here. And there's a guide inside the Malossi paperwork that shows the various sizes of or lengths of bolts. So we're gonna have the shortest. Most of them are gonna be this length, it looks like. a couple longer ones. So there we go. Looks like all those are the same length, and a couple long ones and a short one. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and flip the cases over and start lining everything up. And you're gonna wanna kick the Kickstarter down, because that's how you're gonna be able to get the Kickstarter gear past the mechanism. Sometimes it takes a couple little kicks to get it all to line up, then tip it up. So you may need to steer the drive shaft around to get it to line up with the bearings here. Now there we go. I think there it is. Now it's kind of dropping in place. I see that dropped in place. And did a couple little kicks here. I see the seal drop right onto the crankshaft, and it looks like it closed all the way around. But it's pretty important that you do kick the Kickstarter through. And if you want to get the guide that's included with the Malossi, they illustrate where all the bolts go. The longer bolts are going to go where the dowels go. So I think that's going to be these two, if I recall. And a lot of times, if you just set these all in, you'll see how much they drop in, so you kind of have a good idea. So I think I got the two long ones where the dowels go. Again, you could refer to the Malossi guide. And at this point, I like to use like a T-handle, kind of just get them all spun in place. Just go back and forth, kind of close it up. And you kind of want to just do an alternating pattern. There's not, the Haynes manual does have they do show a pattern. This is the shortest screw right here. Move back up here. The long one with the dowel. And right now I'm just snugging them. I'm not doing the final torque yet. I'll get a torque wrench out next. At this point I can just kind of go around, kind of feel that they're all about even. See how some are a little looser. Definitely works a lot easier than dealing with the nuts that you normally thread on for the stock setup. Make sure the Kickstarter is working, and I see it turning the gear shaft. That's fine. Make sure your crankshaft spins. It's very, very smooth. That's pretty important. I just feel the resistance of the seals, the fresh bearings. I'm going to go ahead and wipe off this excess grease, because you don't want any grease on the flywheel taper. All right, so now we have a torque wrench set to about 11 foot-pounds or 14 newton meters. And we're just gonna go ahead and do the final torque on all these. And again, it's kind of, I usually like to work at the crankcase first. Keeping track of what bolts you have torqued and what you haven't. And then work away from the crankcase. And one thing, if you have the stock motor, there would be a tab that held the the gear change cables. We'll see what our solution is for that. I think I already got that one. Pretty sure I got. Yep, so now we're all torqued up. So there's excess of the sealant coming through the cases. You can use brake cleaner if you do want to clean it up, specifically where the base gasket's going to go. The rest of it coming around is not really going to hurt anything. They do include copper washers and button head screws for the drain and the fill. Go ahead and thread those in place. Normally they'd just be the hex screw with 11mm head on it. And the fill, I just want to thread in partly, just so I keep track of it here. Go ahead and put that in there just a little bit. And a lot of times it's good to put like a tag, tag things that there's no oil in it. So you just remember, because I'm going to put this motor in and probably come back to it. So a lot of times you can make a little tag that just reminds you that there's no gearbox oil in there, and we'll come back to it. Got the drain bolt. We're not going to put any of the dowels or the cable adjusters in on this motor, but the next step is what we're going to do is flip it over and work on the clutch. All right, so I got the original gasket kit ready to go. I got my clutch cover. We checked it all out, cleaned it up. You're going to need this O-ring. It's separate part number 017781. And there's a groove that goes all the way around. Just fit that. A lot of times, that little notch there, I want to make sure this fits, especially with this Malossi setup. It looks like I need to grind it ever so slightly right there. It's just a little bit tight right there. So I'm going to probably do that before I assemble this clutch cover. So we make sure this fits. I notch ground out just a little bit, and it looks like it will fit all the way down. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and assemble the clutch arm. You're going to need to go back into the original gasket kit. Some O-rings in here. There's a real small O-ring, and there's a pair of these larger O-rings. You want to locate the slightly smaller O-ring, and that's the one for this clutch shaft. Put a little grease on everything. And we'll just kind of slide it all the way down until it makes it right into that slot down here. There it is. And remainder of the grease, that's not be good for the setup. We'll go ahead and put this little guy like such. Get it started there. You got this little arm right here that slides in. So you can kind of see how that works. O-ring snaps in, and then to get this, I usually take a puncher or a small screwdriver and just give it a twist. Give it a twist like that, and we'll go ahead and pull the tool out. Check the operation. So this was original push pin. I could see it's a little bit dented in. I didn't catch on the first round, so we're gonna go ahead and put a new one in there. Go ahead and fill that well with some grease. Drop the push pin in place. Sometimes you gotta, there you go, and a little grease on the edge there. So now the clutch cover's all ready to go. The clutch worked 100% perfect, no issues with it, but in many cases you'd replace the steels in the cork plates if you're in the clutch. This is a Koza clutch, they tend to hold up pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and take this inner hub, pop it out just like that. That's the little hub, all the springs are in place. a newer style clutch, but it uses the same compressor, kind of the same idea. The difference being is the clutch springs are on this inner hub versus an original clutch from the period would have the 7 larger springs on the outer perimeter. And again, some of my older videos, I show how those older clutches are assembled. So it's referred to as a Koza clutch. Somebody banded this. That was an extra little step that they did. Go ahead and drop that little cage in there. Put a little oil on this brass bushing here. Don't really need much. Everything still has some oil on it. Go ahead and separate that little brass right there. Put a little oil on that as well. And it should spin really nice on there. So you have the really thick plate. Drop that in. And all these plates were just removed in the same order. They look almost new. So cork plate, and oftentimes you put a little bit of oil on them, but they've already been exposed, the gearbox oil. And there's one extra plate on these style clutches versus the original clutch. And then the last steel and the very last plate here. So now that exposes the slot for the circlip. Sometimes I give these a little stretch. This is a nice sharp circlip. Find the sharper edge. So that's a sharper edge. And we're going to go ahead. Careful not to cut through your gloves. It can cut you pretty easily. And I have the gap right there on one of these outer blades. Make sure it's kind of in all the way around. Go ahead and release it. Now the clutch is all ready for installation. So on the scooter, we're going to retain the oil injection. So there's a pair of thrust washers. We're going to go ahead and drop one of the thrust washers onto that oil pump shaft. Put a little bit of grease on there. There's a little assembly lube. So a potential problem you can run into is the studs driven too far. You can back the stud out. On this one, I'll grind a little bit of the tip of the stud off because I do like that they're seated all the way. So we got this spinning. You always want to make sure with the stud bottom out that's not making contact with the gear because it's very close. Put a little oil on it. Put the last thrust washer on there. Then you have a tiny circlip, external circlip. I went ahead and just got a new one. And it has a little bit of end float. That's no problem there. And while we're at it, we'll go ahead and oil up that main bearing just for its first initial oil. And you have this Woodruff key slot right here. We'll go ahead and put the gear in. And sometimes if they only have a little chamfer on one end, it would go towards the crankshaft. So right now you can see I got the little slot that's on that gear lined up, and I'll get the Woodruff key in place. Make sure it's all keyed up with that. Kind of tip it in there. And at this point it's pretty simple. Drop the clutch on there. You can see the slot. Make sure it doesn't push the key out, and oftentimes you got to make sure everything kind of lines up. So drop down onto the crankshaft, and then it's going to want to key into the gear. So there we go. So it dropped all the way down, and you can kind of look down there carefully with a light and see that the Woodruff key is in place. With the Koza clutch, they use this special type of nut that's kind of serrated on the edge. You could also, as an optional step, you could put a little bit of Loctite on there, which can't hurt anything. for critical fasteners. Same with if you're working with the stock clutch and the tab washer, it's not a bad idea to put a little bit of Loctite. So you want to torque this to about 30 foot-pounds. And there is a special tool that will lock up the clutch. All right, so you take one of your clutch cover bolts, washer's in place, and you find one of the slots on the clutch here. Just like such. Make sure that's threaded in there enough that it doesn't bend the bolt. So we'll go ahead and torque this to about 30 foot-pounds. There we go. And the next step is, the pressure plate does have the clip in there. It's possible to remove it through that larger hole. You see a flat right here, that's only found on the larger displacement clutches. The smaller clutches, this thing's perfectly round. And you could use a little screwdriver or even a large screwdriver, kind of tip it in place and then push it in, and it should snap to hold it in place. There we go. So now that thing's holding in place. Put a little dab of grease on the center here. And you want a little bit of grease for your O-ring, the perimeter of the O-ring for the clutch cover as well. So this all the way around. Go ahead and drop the clutch cover down like this. I already kind of did a test fit before I bolted in. I have a split washer and a flat washer. And if you want to torque these, about 7 foot-pounds all they need. .10mm socket here. I got a T handle, kind of works pretty well. And kind of want to just evenly pull it down. You can see it kind of rocks a little bit just because we do have that. There we go. Kind of give the clutch arm a feel. That's good, not much play in there. Right when it stops, it should be perfectly parallel with this, where the adjuster goes in. If it's bent in a little bit, you may have a push pin that's worn out, a clutch that's out of adjust, that's worn. It could have a bent arm. There's many things, and I'll kind of show you that. So right now, when you turn it, that's about a perfect clutch, where that thing is nice and parallel right there. Here's another little test. You could actually kick the Kickstarter over and you see the crankshaft moving. It feels really, really smooth. Everything's good. Next, we'll move on to setting up the rear brake. So here you have the brake shaft right here. Those last two O-rings that were kind of smaller O-rings right here. I'm going to set those aside for your this arm. And what these do is just hold the grease. And this little groove is to hold extra grease to lubricate this arm here. So just like that, take something like that Maxima grease, the Scooter West part number grease, and just fill that well up with grease, and then a little bit right there, and just a little small amount for each one of those faces for the cam. You don't want too much in the area where the brakes are. So go ahead and slide that in, and it's going to want to goop some of that grease out. We have the arm here. Oftentimes I like to replace that cable clamp. This is the original one. We have these really nice Italian made cable clamp kits, 154738. And this is the direction, so you have the nut just like that. You can kind of see how it's all set up. Go ahead and slide that just like such. And then we have the spring right here. Just kind of slide it backwards. And we'll push this all the way in place. And you can see it all works just fine. I'll get rid of that excess grease. We don't really need that. Put a little bit of grease on these while we're All right, so you're gonna find a little hole in the shaft, and it keeps this this arm in place. Kind of want to tip it over a little bit. And you see the cotter pins popping out on the other side. Get your needle nose. And we'll go ahead and push those out of the way. There you go. So that's all finished right there. A couple last O-rings. You got this large O-ring. This goes around this right here. And you have this pair right here. So it's got kind of this larger O-ring. You slide it onto this. You kind of rip it away from that. And you have the pair of Mickey Mouse ears that drop onto the two pegs for the brake shoes. All right, so before we put the brake backplate, we want to put a little oil on all these holes. They're just straight drilled holes, and they use a self-tapping screw. And it's pretty easy to break off the screw. So what I like to do is just put the screws in each one of them. Probably best just to start with new screws since we're on a brand new case. They're pretty fragile, pretty easy to break off. And got that one started, and then just kind of work it with oil in there. You know, be careful, they're real fragile little screws. So pretty good right there. I think that one's nice. And just not the best design. It would be cool if they were threaded holes, but they're just holding a tin plate on. Sometimes these screws are slotted, sometimes they're Phillips. And we'll do the same with the back one too before we put the plate on. So go ahead and drop this beautiful patinaed vintage backplate right onto this brand new engine case. So it looks wonderful. And we'll go ahead and get all these screws started. The nice thing about them is they don't back out since they kind of bind up with aluminum. And that one's a little loose. There we go. So they're all pretty well seated in there. Now it's time to put the brake shoes on. And we're going to reuse the brakes. They were working just fine. So you put the spring, you want to get the spring all set up like that. So it's hooked into each one of those prongs. And this is where you got to put a little elbow grease into it. So usually I like to get the brake shoe on top of the, see how it's just right there? Kind of sitting on top, it's not quite in a groove. And then it kind of magically all goes into place. So you could make sure it all works right. Take a pair of the Omega clips. These are pretty easy to lose. I think the part number is quadruple 061. And they're usually flimsy enough that you can just push them on by hand. If not, you can use needle nose. Everything's good there. Clean rag, just wipe any dust that's built up on the shoes. And this is that hub, that's a 30mm hub. Put a small amount of grease on this edge that rides the seal. Of course, the PXs have a completely different arrangement. It's just a felt seal in here. And that just kind of sits in place. And I'm not going to tighten this all the way because it's much easier to torque that when you have the tire on it. So do something to remind yourself, put a piece of tape that you don't have this torqued. But that's kind of where I like to leave that. We'll flip this back over. There's one other thing I don't like to put on. It's much easier to install the motor without the airbox installed. I'll drop the gear in usually just to clog that hole up, put a little bit of assembly grease on this lower part of the gear and this little worm gear that kind of self-lubricates some of the parts of it. And this is the direction it goes in. And it kind of just engages with the gear, drops in just like that. So with everything all clean right here, we'll go ahead and put some duct tape over that. Last thing you want is any hardware to go down the intake. So just like that, it's all prepared. So let's do the fun part. Let's put a cylinder on it. And again, sometimes the cylinder, it's best to install the cylinder with it installed in the scooter, but the circlips are definitely easier to deal with, and I'll do it. You can do it either way. So like I said, it's possible to install the cases. You probably want to remove the studs because if you're going to put the cylinder on while the engine's in the frame, you're going to have the studs removed. But we know this is all good. It was running, had a great compression. This cleaned it up just a tiny bit. Go ahead and put some 2-stroke oil in there. Just kind of wipe the inside of the barrel. You don't need much at all. You mainly want to use some of the 2-stroke to kind of wipe any dirt or anything that's been left behind from it being exposed. Needs only a real fine film of oil on there. So the Malossi cases don't use this alignment dowel. They just rely on the machine studs. These are a little thicker studs. And so you're gonna have to remove this dowel. You're gonna take a little bit of elbow grease with a good set of pliers. The original cases, they have this machined into the case. So you pull that out. Looks like a roll pin right there. And we'll double check the fitment one more time. Now it goes right up against the cylinder there. Yeah, now that we know the fitment's pretty good, we're gonna go ahead and install the piston. So there's a little arrow here that points towards the exhaust. The other way to know is this is your third port, and the third port kind of lines up right there. So approximately line it up. Put a small amount of 2-stroke oil on the rings. And there's specialized tools for doing this, but they got a pretty nice ramp right here that allows you to squeeze the rings. Keep in mind they do have alignment dowels that kind of align the rings right there and right there, and that keeps the rings out of the ports. It's pretty easy to mess these up. And it's always easier to stuff a piston versus doing it with it attached to the connecting rod. So you're always better off getting it stuffed into the barrel, looking where the pegs are there. I already checked these ring-in gaps and did all that on that the video, checking the specifications. Just rock it in. We're not going to go too far with it in there because sometimes you do have to slide it, move it around. So there's some wiggle room right here. If you go too far, you can catch the rings on the ports, and that's usually not a good situation. So in the gasket kit is a base gasket. If you want to not weep as much oil, you could put some silicone sealant on this, just a real thin coat, or even that 3-bond would work just as well. So the way this goes is you got that little port right there. And we'll go ahead and slide it on over the studs here. All right, so we'll start with a brand new circlip for the piston. I think it's 006616. I think it's the correct part number for the 16 millimeter wrist pin clip, and we're gonna set up our circlip pliers. And again, just like any circlip, there's a sharp edge. And we'll put the gap facing down. You don't want to have the gap facing this way. I've seen them facing that way. I've never, no issues, but that's just kind of like the rule of thumb. Got it in there. It's in the groove right there. Next, we'll take our pin and even the needle bearing, oil that all up. And from this side, gonna rock that in there, and it's a really nice fit. Generally, you don't need a piston pin puller, but we do have that available. Sometimes they can be a little bit stubborn. We're gonna go ahead and put the needle bearing in the small end of the connecting rod right there. So at this point, we're pretty close. I'm kind of eyeballing it through the ports of the piston. Get the bearing kind of close to where it needs to go. And this is where you may need to rotate the piston just a little bit. Get everything to kind of line up and for it to go through that bearing. You may want to eyeball it through from the back side. Sometimes you use the plastic part of as a hammer. You don't want to use a hammer because pretty easy to damage the connecting rod. In this case, you may want to use a piston pin puller to pull it in, but just real lightweight taps is not going to hurt anything. And we'll tap that all the way home with a little 10 millimeter socket. And it's up against the circlip. Go ahead and install the second circlip. And this one, I'm gonna make sure it's in the groove because it's a lot easier to miss the groove right there, and then you end up with a circlip bouncing around in your combustion chamber. I kind of like to push on it, make sure it really clicked into the groove. And at this point, put a little bit of oil on the skirts of the piston, mainly the upper and lower sections. We know the big end and the small end bearing have oil on them. So we'll go ahead and push the cylinder all the way home. Be careful not to pinch that gasket. And it's pretty much sent all the way home. One thing I forgot to show, a lot of times I lap the head with valve grinding compound up against the cast iron. This wasn't leaking that much. Sometimes you can also spray this copper spray. I've seen people use that. But there's no head gasket. This is a newer style head that has these little extra supports right here. I'll leave the spark plug in there loose for right now and slide the head on. It wasn't really leaking that much, so I don't see any need to lap it. I'm gonna put 4 flat washers and then 4 split washers. Use the socket to kind of push them in place. Again, there's no dowel or anything on the head. These split washers are still good. I would replace them if they're questionable. You can barely get your fingers in here. And at this point, I'll go ahead and thread all the nuts on. And in some cases, on the older original studs, you typically would thread a nut on, then thread the spacer. With these studs that are included with the Malossi and the later PXs, they just use a spacer on this upper backside position. So we'll go ahead, kind of just go all the way around. And we could just do it by hand at first. Then you want to set up a torque wrench for about 16 foot-pounds. Right now they're all just seated. And you kind of go in a diagonal pattern there. All right, so my first round, I'm gonna go about right to 10 foot-pounds. About 10 foot-pounds. And then kind of just doing it in an X pattern. So I'm watching the display on this torque wrench. I don't have it set to beep. And then I'll go to about 13 foot-pounds. And 13 foot-pounds. And we'll do the last, so right to 16 foot-pounds. 16.0. And having these evenly torqued kind of prevents them from leaking. There we go. All right, so figure just put the shroud on. Either way, put it on with the scooter in the frame. I got the original screw. It's got like a little wave washer. It kind of locks it in place, threads into that spacer. And you can leave the spark plug in there, tighten it. A lot of times at this point I'd probably do another kick over. Keep in mind, if it's in gear, it's going to be pretty difficult to kick over with the hub and all that. Just make sure everything turns over and you don't have any binding. All right, so there's pretty much how you assemble a P-Series motor. As you can see, it's not 100% assembled. This is usually this stage where I like to stop and put the motor in the frame. I don't have the airbox on it, I don't have the stator on it. Kind of keeps the weight off it. Obviously a selector box isn't on there. All that stuff is really easy to install, and actually easier when it's up in the frame anyway. So got the tape over the intake, and at this point it's kind of like a fairly lightweight package that I can just handle by myself. So check out the next video. I'm gonna pop this motor into the frame. We're not gonna get it started on the next video, but we'll get it installed.